This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 13. The Magnet Switch. The guardsmen paid not the slightest attention to their wards, for the red men could not move over 2 feet from the great rings to which they were padlocked, though each had seized a weapon upon which he had been engaged when I entered the room, and stood ready to join me could they have but done so. The yellow men devoted all their attention to me, nor were they long in discovering that the 3 of them were none too many to defend the armory against John Carter. Would that I had had my own good longsword in my hand that day, but, as it was, I rendered a satisfactory account of myself with the unfamiliar weapon of the yellow men. At first I had a time of it dodging their villainous hook swords, but after a minute or two I had succeeded in wresting a second straight sword from one of the racks along the wall, and thereafter, using it to parry the hooks of my antagonists, I felt more evenly equipped. The 3 of them were on me at once, and but for a lucky circumstance my end might have come quickly. The foremost guardsman made a vicious lunge for my side with his hook after the 3 of them had backed me against the wall, but as I sidestepped and raised my arm his weapon but grazed my side, passing into a rack of javelins, where it became entangled. Before he could release it I had run him through, and then, falling back upon the tactics that have saved me 100 times in tight pinches, I rushed the 2 remaining warriors, forcing them back with a perfect torrent of cuts and thrusts, weaving my sword in and out about their guards until I had the fear of death upon them. Then one of them commenced calling for help, but it was too late to save them. They were as putty in my hands now, and I backed them about the armory as I would until I had them where I wanted them, within reach of the swords of the shackled slaves. In an instant both lay dead upon the floor, but their cries had not been entirely fruitless, for now I heard answering shouts and the footfalls of many men running and the clank of accoutrements and the commands of officers. "The door! Quick, John Carter! Bar the door!" cried Tardos Morse. Already the guard was in sight, charging across the open court that was visible through the doorway. A dozen seconds would bring them into the tower. A single leap carried me to the heavy portal. With a resounding bang I slammed it shut. "The bar!" shouted Tardos Morse. I tried to slip the huge fastening into place, but it defied my every attempt. "Raise it a little to release the catch," cried one of the red men. I could hear the yellow warriors leaping along the flagging just beyond the door. I raised the bar and shot it to the right just as the foremost of the guardsmen threw himself against the opposite side of the massive panels. The barrier held. I had been in time, but by the fraction of a second only. Now I turned my attention to the prisoners. To Tardos Morse I went first, asking where the keys might be which would unfasten their fetters. "The officer of the guard has them," replied the Jetic of Helium, "and he is among those without who seek entrance. You will have to force them." Most of the prisoners were already hacking at their bonds with the swords in their hands. The yellow men were battering at the door with javelins and axes. I turned my attention to the chains that held Tardos Morse. Again and again I cut deep into the metal with my sharp blade, but ever faster and faster fell the torrent of blows upon the portal. At last a link parted beneath my efforts, and a moment later Tardos Morse was free, though a few inches of trailing chain still dangled from his ankle. A splinter of wood falling inward from the door announced the headway that our enemies were making toward us. The mighty panels trembled and bent beneath the furious onslaught of the enraged yellow men. What with the battering upon the door and the hacking of the red men at their chains, the din within the armory was appalling. No sooner was Tardos Morse free than he turned his attention to another of the prisoners, while I set to work to liberate Morse Kajak. We must work fast if we would have all those fetters cut before the door gave way. Now a panel crashed inward upon the floor, and Morse Kajak sprang to the opening to defend the way until we should have time to release the others. With javelins snatched from the wall he wrought havoc among the foremost of the Alcarians, while we battled with the insensate metal that stood between our fellows and freedom. At length all but one of the prisoners were freed, and then the door fell with a mighty crash before a hastily improvised battering ram, and the yellow horde was upon us. "To the upper chambers!" shouted the red men, who was still fettered to the floor. "To the upper chambers! There you may defend the tower against all Cadabra. Do not delay because of me, who could pray for no better death than in the service of Tardos Mors and the Prince of Helium. But I would have sacrificed the life of every man of us rather than desert a single redman, much less the lion-hearted hero who begged us to leave him. Cut his chains," I cried to 2 of the redmen, "while the balance of us hold off the foe." There were 10 of us now to do battle with the Ocarian guard, and I warrant that ancient watchtower never looked down upon a more hotly contested battle than took place that day within its own grim walls. The first inrushing wave of yellow warriors recoiled from the slashing blades of 10 of Helium's veteran fighting men. A dozen Ocarian corpses blocked the doorway, but over the gruesome barrier a score more of their fellows dashed, shouting their hoarse and hideous war-cry. Upon the bloody mound we met them, hand to hand, stabbing where the quarters were too close to cut, thrusting when we could push a foeman to arm's length, and mingled with the wild cry of the Ocarian, there rose and fell the glorious words, "For Helium! For Helium!" that for countless ages have spurred on the bravest of the brave to those deeds of valor that have sent the fame of Helium's heroes broadcast throughout the length and breadth of a world. Now were the fetters struck from the last of the red men, and 13 strong we met each new charge of the soldiers of Silensis Ol. Scarce one of us but bled from a score of wounds, yet none had fallen. From without we saw hundreds of guardsmen pouring into the courtyard, and along the lower corridor from which I had found my way to the armory we could hear the clank of metal and the shouting of men. In a moment we should be attacked from 2 sides, and with all our prowess we could not hope to withstand the unequal odds which would thus divide our attention and our small numbers. "To the upper chambers!" cried Tardos Mors, and a moment later we fell back toward the runway that led to the floors above. Here another bloody battle was waged with the force of yellow men who charged into the armory as we fell back from the doorway. Here we lost our first man, a noble fellow whom we could ill spare, but at length all had backed into the runway except myself, who remained to hold back the Ocarian until the others were safe above. In the mouth of the narrow spiral but a single warrior could attack me at a time, so that I had little difficulty in holding them all back for the brief moment that was necessary. Then, backing slowly before them, I commenced the ascent of the spiral. All the long way to the tower's top the guardsmen pressed me closely. When one went down before my sword, another scrambled over the dead man to take his place, and thus, taking an awful toll with each few feet gained, I came to the spacious glass-walled watchtower of Cadabra. Here my companions clustered ready to take my place, and for a moment's respite I stepped to one side, while they held the enemy off. From the lofty perch a view could be had for miles in every direction. Toward the south stretched the rugged, ice-clad waste to the edge of the mighty barrier. Toward the east and west, and dimly toward the north, I descried other Ocarian cities, while in the immediate foreground, just beyond the walls of Cadabra, the grim guardian shaft reared its sombre head. Then I cast my eyes down into the streets of Cadabra, from which a sudden tumult had arisen, and there I saw a battle raging, and beyond the city's walls I saw armed men marching in great columns towards a nearby gate. Eagerly I pressed forward against the glass wall of the observatory, scarce daring to credit the testimony of my own eyes. But at last I could doubt no longer, and with a shout of joy that rose strangely in the midst of the cursing and groaning of the battling men at the entrance to the chamber, I called to Tardos Mors. As he joined me, I pointed down into the streets of Cadabra, and to the advancing columns beyond, above which floated bravely in the arctic air the flags and banners of Helium. An instant later every red man in the lofty chamber had seen the inspiring sight, and such a shout of thanksgiving arose as I warrant never before echoed through the age-old pile of stone. But still we must fight on, for though our troops had entered Cadabra, the city was yet far from capitulation, nor had the palace been ever assaulted. Turn and turn about we held the top of the runway, while the others feasted their eyes upon the sight of our valiant countrymen battling far beneath us. Now they have rushed the palace gate,
Great battering rams are dashed against its formidable surface. Now they are repulsed by a deadly shower of javelins from the wall's top. Once again they charge, but a sortie by a large force of Ocarians from an intersecting avenue crumples the head of the column, and the men of Helium go down, fighting, beneath an overwhelming force. The palace gate flies open, and a force of the Jedic's own guard, picked men from the flower of the Ocarian army, sallies forth to shatter the broken regiments. For a moment it looks as though nothing could avert defeat, and then I see a noble figure upon a mighty thoat, not the tiny thoat of the red men, but one of his huge cousins of the Dead Sea bottoms. The warrior hews his way to the front, and behind him rally the disorganized soldiers of Helium. As he raises his head aloft to fling a challenge at the men upon the palace walls, I see his face, and my heart swells in pride and happiness as the red warriors leap to the side of their leader and win back the ground that they had but just lost. The face of him upon the mighty thoat is the face of my son, Carthoris of Helium. At his side fights a huge Martian war-hound, nor did I need a second look to know that it was Wula, my faithful Wula, who had thus well performed his arduous task and brought the succouring legions in the nick of time. In the nick of time? Who yet might say that they were not too late to save, but surely they could avenge, and such retribution as that unconquered army would deal out to the hateful Ocarians. I sighed to think that I might not be alive to witness it. Again I turned to the windows. The red men had not yet forced the outer palace wall, but they were fighting nobly against the best that Ocar afforded, valiant warriors who contested every inch of the way. Now my attention was caught by a new element without the city wall, a great body of mounted warriors looming large above the red men. They were the huge green allies of Helium, the savage hordes from the Dead Sea bottoms of the far south. In grim and terrible silence they sped on toward the gate, the padded hoofs of their frightful mounts giving forth no sound. Into the doomed city they charged, and as they wheeled across the wide plaza before the palace of the Jedic of Jedics, I saw, riding at their head, the mighty figure of their mighty leader, Tars Tarkas, Jedic of Thark. My wish, then, was to be gratified, for I was to see my old friend battling once again, and though not shoulder to shoulder with him, I too would be fighting in the same cause here in the high tower of Ocar. Nor did it seem that our foes would ever cease their stubborn attacks, for still they came, though the way to our chamber was often clogged with the bodies of their dead. At times they would pause long enough to drag back the impeding corpses, and then fresh warriors would forge upward to taste the cup of death. I had been taking my turn with the others in defending the approach of our lofty retreat, when Mors Kajak, who had been watching the battle in the street below, called aloud in sudden excitement. There was a note of apprehension in his voice that brought me to his side the instant that I could turn my place over to another, and as I reached him he pointed far out across the waste of snow and ice toward the southern horizon. "Alas," he cried, "that I should be forced to witness cruel fate betray them without power to warn or aid, but they be past either now." As I looked in the direction he indicated, I saw the cause of his perturbation. A mighty fleet of flyers was approaching majestically toward Cadabra from the direction of the ice barrier. On and on they came with ever-increasing velocity. "The grim shaft that they call the Guardian of the North is beckoning to them," said Mors Kajak sadly, "just as it beckoned to Tardos Mors and his great fleet. See where they lay, crumpled and broken, a grim and terrible monument to the mighty force of destruction which naught can resist." I too saw, but something else I saw that Mors Kajak did not. In my mind's eye I saw a buried chamber whose walls were lined with strange instruments and devices. In the center of the chamber was a long table, and before it sat a little pop-eyed old man counting his money. But plainest of all, I saw upon the wall a great switch with a small magnet inlaid within the surface of its black handle. Then I glanced out at the fast-approaching fleet. In 5 minutes that mighty armada of the skies would be bent and worthless scrap, laying at the base of the shaft beyond the city's wall, and yellow hordes would be loosed from another gate to rush out upon the few survivors, stumbling blindly down through the mass of wreckage. Then the Apps would come. I shuddered at the thought, for I could vividly picture the whole horrible scene. Quick have I always been to decide and act. The impulse that moves me and the doing of the thing seem simultaneous. For if my mind goes through the tedious formality of reasoning, it must be a subconscious act of which I am not objectively aware. Psychologists tell me that, as the subconscious does not reason, too close a scrutiny of my mental activities might prove anything but flattering, but be that as it may, I have often won success while the thinker would have been still at the endless task of comparing various judgments. And now celerity of action was the prime essential to the success of the thing that I had decided upon. Grasping my sword more firmly in my hand, I called to the red men at the opening to the runway to stand aside. "Way for the Prince of Helium!" I shouted, and before the astonished yellow men, whose misfortune it was to be at the fighting end of the line at that particular moment, could gather his wits together, my sword had decapitated him, and I was rushing like a mad bull down upon those behind him. "Way for the Prince of Helium!" I shouted as I cut a path through the astonished guardsmen of Silence's Ol. Hewing to right and left, I beat my way down that warrior-choked spiral until, near the bottom, those below, thinking that an army was descending upon them, turned and fled. The armory at the first floor was vacant when I entered it, the last of the Okarian having fled into the courtyard, so none saw me continue down the spiral toward the corridor beneath. Here I ran as rapidly as my legs would carry me toward the 5 corners, and there plunged into the passageway that led to the station of the old miser. Without the formality of a knock, I burst into the room. There sat the old man at his table, but as he saw me he sprung to his feet, drawing his sword. With scarce more than a glance toward him, I leaped for the great switch. But quick as I was, that wiry old fellow was there before me. How he did it I shall never know, nor does it seem credible that any Martian-born creature could approximate the marvelous speed of my earthly muscles. Like a tiger he turned upon me, and I was quick to see why Solon had been chosen for this important duty. Never in all my life have I seen such wondrous swordsmanship, and such uncanny agility as that ancient bag of bones displayed. He was in 40 places at the same time, and before I had half a chance to awaken to my danger, he was like to have made a monkey of me, and a dead monkey at that. It is strange how new and unexpected conditions bring out unguessed ability to meet them. That day in the buried chamber beneath the palace of Silence's Ol, I learned what swordsmanship meant, and to what heights of sword mastery I could achieve when pitted against such a wizard of the blade as Solon. For a time he liked to have bested me, but presently the latent possibilities that must have been lying dormant within me for a lifetime came to the fore. I fought as I had never dreamed a human being could fight. That duel royale should have taken place in the dark recesses of a cellar without a single appreciative eye to witness it has always seemed to me almost a world calamity, at least from the viewpoint of Barsoomian, where bloody strife is the first and greatest consideration of individuals, nations, and races. I was fighting to reach the switch, Solon to prevent me, and though we stood not 3 feet from it, I could not win an inch toward it, for he forced me back an inch for the first 5 minutes of our battle. I knew that if I were to throw it in time to save the oncoming fleet, it must be done in the next few seconds, and so I tried my old rushing tactics, but I might as well have rushed a brick wall for all that Solon gave way. In fact, I came near to impaling myself upon his point for my pains, but right was on my side, and I think that must give a man greater confidence than though he knew himself to be battling in a wicked cause. At least, I did not want in confidence, and when I next rushed Solon it was to one side with implicit confidence that he must turn to meet my new line of attack, and turn he did. So now that we fought with our sides toward the coveted goal, the great switch stood within my reach upon my right hand. To uncover my breast for an instant would have been to court sudden death, but I saw no other way than to chance it, if by so doing I might rescue that oncoming succouring fleet, and so, in the face of a wicked sword thrust, I reached out my point and caught the great switch a sudden blow that released it from its seating. So surprised and horrified was Solon that he forgot to finish his thrust. Instead, he wheeled toward the switch with a loud shriek, a shriek which was his last, for before his hand could touch the lever it sought, my sword's point had passed through his heart. End of chapter 13.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior.
Chapter 14. The Tide of Battle. But Solon's last loud cry had not been without effect, for a moment later a dozen guardsmen burst into the chamber, though not before I had so bent and demolished the great switch that it could not be again used to turn the powerful current into the mighty magnet of destruction it controlled. The result of the sudden coming of the guardsmen had been to compel me to seek seclusion in the first passageway that I could find, and that, to my disappointment, proved to be not the one with which I was familiar, but another upon its left. They must have either heard or guessed which way I went, for I had proceeded but a short distance when I heard the sound of pursuit. I had no mind to stop and fight these men here when there was fighting aplenty elsewhere in the city of Cadabra, fighting that could be of much more avail to me and mine than useless life-taking far below the palace. But the fellows were pressing me, and as I did not know the way at all, I soon saw that they would overtake me unless I found a place to conceal myself until they had passed, which would then give me an opportunity to return the way I had come and regain the tower, or possibly find a way to reach the city streets. The passageway had risen rapidly since leaving the apartment of the switch, and now ran level and well lighted, straight into the distance as far as I could see. The moment that my pursuers reached this straight stretch, I would be in plain sight of them, with no chance to escape from the corridor undetected. Presently I saw a series of doors opening from either side of the corridor, and as they all looked alike to me, I tried the first one that I reached. It opened into a small chamber, luxuriously furnished, and was evidently an antechamber off some office or audience chamber of the palace. On the far side was a heavily curtained doorway, beyond which I heard the hum of voices. Instantly I crossed the small chamber, and, parting the curtains, looked within the larger apartment. Before me were a party of perhaps 50 gorgeously clad nobles of the court, standing before a throne upon which sat Silensis Ol, the Jetic of Jetics, was addressing them. "The allotted hour has come," he was saying, as I entered the apartment, "and though the enemies of Okar be within her gates, naught may stay the will of Silensis Ol. The great ceremony must be omitted, that no single man may be kept from his place in the defences other than the 50 that custom demands shall witness the creation of a new queen in Okar. In a moment the thing shall be done, and we may return to the battle, while she who is now the Princess of Helium looks down from the Queen's tower upon the annihilation of her former countrymen, and witnesses the greatness which is her husband's." Then, turning to a courier, he issued some command in a low voice. The addressed hastened to a small door at the far end of the chamber, and swinging it wide, cry, "Way for Dejah Thoris, future Queen of Okar." Immediately 2 guardsmen appeared dragging the unwilling bride toward the altar. Her hands were still manacled behind her, evidently to prevent suicide. Her dishevelled hair and panting bosom betokened that, chained though she was, still had she fought against the thing that they would do to her. At sight of her, Silensis Ol rose and drew his sword, and the sword of each of the 50 nobles were raised on high to form an arc, beneath which the poor, beautiful creature was dragged toward her doom. A grim smile forced itself to my lips as I thought of the rude awakening that lay in store for the ruler of Okar, and my itching fingers fondled the hilt of my bloody sword. As I watched the procession that moved slowly toward the throne, a procession which consisted of but a handful of priests who followed Dejah Thoris and the 2 guardsmen, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a black face peering from behind the draperies that covered the wall back of the dais upon which stood Silensis Ol awaiting his bride. Now the guardsmen were forcing the Princess of Helium up the few steps to the side of the tyrant of Okar, and I had no eyes and no thoughts for aught else. A priest opened a book, and raising his hand, commenced to drone out a single song ritual. Solensis Ol reached for the hand of his bride. I had intended waiting until some circumstance should give me a reasonable hope of success, for even though the entire ceremony should be completed, there could be no valid marriage while I lived. What I was most concerned in, of course, was the rescuing of Dejah Thoris. I wished to take her from the palace of Solensis Ol, if such a thing were possible, but whether it were accomplished before or after the mock marriage was a matter of secondary import. When, however, I saw the vile hand of Solensis Ol reach out for the hand of my beloved princess, I could restrain myself no longer, and before the nobles of Okar knew that aught had happened, I had leaped through their thin line and was upon the dais before Dejah Thoris and Solensis Ol. With the flat of my sword I struck down his polluting hand, and grasping Dejah Thoris round the waist, I swung her behind me as with my back against the draperies of the dais. I faced the tyrant of the north, and his roomful of noble warriors. The Jeddak of Jeddaks was a great mountain of a man, a coarse, brutal beast of a man, and as he towered above me there, his fierce black whiskers and mustache bristling in rage, I can well imagine that a less seasoned warrior might have trembled before him. With a snarl he sprang toward me with naked sword, but whether Solensis Ol was a good swordsman or a poor I never learned, for with Dejah Thoris at my back I was no longer human, I was a superman, and no man could have withstood me then. With a single blow for the Princess of Helium, I ran my blade straight through the rotten heart of Okar's rotten ruler, and before the white, drawn faces of his nobles, Solensis Ol rolled, grinning in horrible death, to the foot of the steps below his marriage throne. For a moment tense silence reigned in the nuptial room. Then the 50 nobles rushed upon me. Furiously we fought, but the advantage was mine, for I stood upon a raised platform above them, and I fought for the most glorious woman of a glorious race, and I fought for a great love and for the mother of my boy. And from behind my shoulder, in the silvery cadence of that dear voice, rose the brave battle anthem of Helium which the nation's women sing as their men march out to victory. That alone was enough to inspire me to victory over even greater odds, and I verily believe that I should have bested the entire roomful of yellow warriors that day in the nuptial chamber of the palace of Kadabra had not interruption come to my aid. Fast and furious was the fighting as the nobles of Solensis Ol sprang, time and again, up the steps before the throne only to fall back before a sword hand that seemed to have gained a new wizardry from its experience with the cunning Solon. 2 were pressing me so closely that I could not turn when I heard a movement behind me, and noted that the sound of the battle anthem had ceased. Was Dejah Thoris preparing to take her place beside me? Heroic daughter of heroic world, it would not be unlike her to have seized a sword and fought at my side, for though the women of Mars are not trained in the arts of war, the spirit is theirs, and they have been known to do that very thing upon countless occasions. But she did not come, and glad I was, for it would have doubled my burden in protecting her before I should have been able to force her back again out of harm's way. She must be contemplating some cunning strategy, I thought, and so I fought on secure in the belief that my divine princess stood close behind me. For half an hour at least I must have fought there against the nobles of Okar, ere ever one placed a foot upon the dais where I stood, and then of a sudden all that remained of them formed below me for a last, mad, desperate charge. But even as they advanced, the door at the far end of the chamber swung wide, and a wild-eyed messenger sprang into the room. "The Jeddak of Jeddaks," he cried. "Where's the Jeddak of Jeddaks? This city has fallen before the hordes from beyond the barrier, and but now the great gate of the palace itself has been forced, and the warriors of the south are pouring into its sacred precincts. Where is Solensis Ol? He alone may revive the flagging courage of our warriors. He alone may save the day for Okar. Where is Solensis Ol?" The nobles stepped back from about the dead body of their ruler, and one of them pointed to the grinning corpse. The messenger staggered back in horror as though from a blow in the face. "Then fly, nobles of Okar," he cried, "for naught can save you. Hark, they come!" As he spoke we heard the deep roar of angry men from the corridor without, and the clank of metal and the clang of swords. Without another glance toward me, who had stood a spectator of the tragic scene, the nobles wheeled and fled from the apartment through another exit. Almost immediately a force of yellow warriors appeared in the doorway through which the messenger had come. They were backing toward the apartment, stubbornly resisting the advance of a handful of red men who faced them and forced them slowly but inevitably back. Above the heads of the contestants I could see from my elevated station upon the dais the face of my old friend Kantos Kan. He was leading the little party that had won its way into the very heart of the palace of Silensis Ol. In an instant I saw that by attacking the Okarians from the rear I could so quickly disorganize them that their further resistance would be short-lived, and with this idea in mind I sprang from the dais, casting a word of explanation to Dejathoris over my shoulder, though I did not turn to look at her. With myself ever between her enemies and herself, and with Kantos Kan and his warriors winning to the apartment, there could be no danger to Dejathoris standing there alone beside the throne. I wanted the men of Helium to see me and to know that their beloved princess was here too, for I knew that this knowledge would inspire them to even greater deeds of valor than they had performed in the past, though great indeed must have been those which won for them a way into the almost impregnable palace of the tyrant of the north. As I crossed the chamber to attack the Cadaverans from the rear, a small doorway at my left opened, and to my surprise revealed the figures of Mata Shang, father of Therns, and Feodor, his daughter, peering into the room. A quick glance about they took. Their eyes rested for a moment wide in horror upon the dead body of Silensis Ol, upon the blood that crimsoned the floor, upon the corpse of the nobles who had fallen thick before the throne, upon me, and upon the battling warriors at the other door. They did not essay to enter the apartment, but scanned its every corner from where they stood, and then, when their eyes had sought its entire area, a look of fierce rage overspread the features of Mata Shang, and a cold and cunning smile touched the lips of Feodor. Then they were gone, but not before a taunting laugh was thrown directly in my face by the woman. I did not understand then the meaning of Mata Shang's rage or Feodor's pleasure, but I knew that neither boded good for me. A moment later I was upon the backs of the yellow men, and as the red men of Helium saw me above the shoulders of their antagonists, a great shout rang through the corridor, and for a moment drowned the noise of battle. "For the Prince of Helium!" they cried. "For the Prince of Helium!" And like hungry lions upon their prey, they fell once more upon the weakened warriors of the north. The yellow men, cornered between two enemies, fought with the desperation that utter hopelessness often induces. Fought as I should have fought had been in their stead, with the determination to take as many of my enemies with me when I died as lay within the power of my sword arm. It was a glorious battle, but the end seemed inevitable, when presently from down the corridor behind the red men came a great body of reinforcing yellow warriors. Now were the tables turned, and it was the men of Helium who seemed doomed to be ground between two millstones. All were compelled to turn to meet this new assault by a greatly superior force, so that to me was left the remnants of the yellow men within the throne room. They kept me busy too, so busy that I began to wonder if indeed I should have ever been done with them. Slowly they pressed me back into the room, and when they had all passed in after me, one of them closed and bolted the door, effectually barring the way against the men of Kantos Kan. It was a clever move, for it put me at the mercy of a dozen men within a chamber from which assistance was locked out, and it gave the red men in the corridor beyond no avenue of escape should their new antagonists press them too closely. But I have faced heavier odds myself than were pitted against me that day, and I knew that Kantos Kan had battled his way from 100 more dangerous traps than that in which he now was. So it was with no feelings of despair that I turned my attention to the business of the moment. Constantly my thoughts reverted to Dejathoris, and I longed for the moment when, the fighting done, I could fold her in my arms, and hear once more the words of love which had been denied me for so many years. During the fighting in the chamber, I had not even a single chance to so much as steal a glance at her where she stood behind me beside the throne of the dead ruler. I wondered why she no longer urged me on with the strains of the martial hymn of Helium, but I did not need more than the knowledge that I was battling for her to bring out the best that is in me. It would be wearisome to narrate the details of that bloody struggle, of how we fought from the doorway, the full length of the room to the very foot of the throne before the last of my antagonists fell with my blade piercing his heart. And then, with a glad cry, I turned with outstretched arms to seize my princess, and as my lips smothered hers, to reap the reward that would be thrice ample payment for the bloody encounters through which I had passed for her dear sake from the South Pole to the North. The glad cry died, frozen upon my lips. My arms dropped limp and lifeless to my sides. As one who reels beneath the burden of a mortal wound, I staggered up the steps before the throne. Dejah Thoris was gone. End of chapter 14.